Welcome to session two, titled Learning to Stand Together, a Call for Higher Education to Bridge the American Divide Through Equity. My name is Manny Mortzanos, and I have the privilege of serving as the back channel moderator for this session. And I will invite David French and Commissioner Daphne to join us. And as they do, I wanted to set the stage for our discussion this afternoon. Based on the writings of David French and his most recent book, Divided We Fall, our discussion today focuses on equity and establishing national unity through pluralism. As we examine the role of shaping the future of higher education, we ask ourselves as practitioners, what is our social responsibility as educational administrators? Is learning just cognitive development, or should we instill social values such as compassion, community engagement, and equity? And I would also include the power skills that Dr. McNair mentioned. We will examine these challenging issues throughout this session and throughout the entire series. Before I introduce our amazing speaker and facilitator, I would like to remind you to remain active in the chat room and to post your questions in the Q&A feature. So without further delay, I introduce to you our speaker, David French, a graduate of Harvard Law School and senior editor of The Dispatch. And our moderator for this session is Dr. Ned Daphne, Chancellor Emeritus of North Orange Community College District, and currently an ACC Commissioner. Gentlemen, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, good morning to all of those who are joining us. David, it's just been a fascinating time to get to know you. You present many ideas in your book, Divided We Fall, that are exciting to behold. We could all benefit from you probably giving us a broader idea of what you wrote in the book, particularly as it pertains to diversity.
Yeah, so the book begins with a pretty provocative paragraph that says that the continued unity, the continued unity of the United States of America can't be guaranteed. And the reason for that is that there is no truly important and meaningful social, cultural, political, or religious trend that is pulling Americans together more than it is pushing us apart. And we can look at all of the different layers of this. This is like peeling an onion. So for example, there's a phenomenon identified since Bill Bishop's excellent book from 2009 called The Big Sort, where people are congregating in like-minded communities. And we just saw in 2020, for example, more people lived in what are called landslide counties. A landslide county is one where one candidate wins the vote by 20 points or more than any time since we've been measuring the statistic in the modern era. So we're beginning to cluster into like-minded communities. As we cluster into like-minded communities, what is beginning to happen is a dynamic called the law of group polarization. And this is something where when people of like mind gather, they tend to become more extreme in their thinking. So we're clustering in like-minded communities. We're becoming more extreme in our thinking. As this is happening, it's not as if we're looking at our fellow or our political opponents through a lens of affection or even tolerance. And so what we're seeing is an extreme amount of rising animosity between the two great political tribes, the red and blue in this country, where overwhelmingly people from both sides will ascribe very negative characteristics to their political opponents, up to and including this now rising phenomenon of what's called lethal mass partisanship, where people ascribe inhuman characteristics to their political opponents, or are indifferent, for example, to their very lives. And what does this mean for equity? It's pretty apparent that what's beginning to happen is that there are elements of American society who now are so threatened by their political opponents, they don't seek to just defeat them in a political contest. They seek to dominate them. There's no desire to accommodate in a pluralistic sense, but in essence, a desire to dominate, to suppress, to oppress. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to kind of wave an alarm, or to sound the alarm bell that says, we cannot keep doing this forever. We cannot keep going down this road forever and hope to stay united as a country.
Oh, that's not only interesting, it sets the stage for the next part of my query to you. In chapter 9 of your book, you talk about the whole concept of the Overton window. Could you
Mhm.
explain or describe that concept for us so that we can understand its implications for equity?
Yeah, so I'm as you'll see as I talk, I'm taking a lot of other people's ideas and combining them in this book. So I've talked about Bill Bishop's Big Sort, Cass Sunstein's Law of Group Polarization. Well, now their Overton window comes from a think tank in Michigan. And what it essentially means is the Overton window is the range of acceptable discourse. So the Overton window will move over time. So, for example, it wasn't that long ago in American history where it was acceptable in public discourse to engage in blatantly and overtly use racial epithets, for example. This was within the Overton window, and that is now moved. The Overton window is moved where that is no longer permissible and to maintain your standing in polite society. So the Overton window can move in good ways, as I just described. It can move in bad ways. But what it is, it's the boundary of acceptable speech. And what I argue in the book is that as our two political tribes pull apart, what we're beginning to have are two separate Overton windows, so that discussion and debate that can exist in one community often can't even exist in another community. So I'll give you a good example on that's just in the that was just in the news today, mainly in conservative media. The presidents of all of the major Southern Baptist seminaries issued a statement reaffirming some basic Baptist theology, but also condemning critical race theory as a concept, as incompatible, incompatible with scriptural orthodoxy. And so what in essence is happening is one side of the political aisle is trying to say that critical race theory is outside of the Overton window in this particular part of American life. And so what happens is if these two Overton windows pull apart, our ability to even talk to each other, for example, about this incredibly important issue of the legacy of present and the legacy of historical racism and existing racism, to talk to each other on terms that both of us will understand and both of us can engage in without sort of fear of attack from the flanks of each side is diminishing. And so as the Overton windows pull apart, we can't even talk to each other in a way that will clearly communicate.
David, how do we get to this? How do we get to understanding, for instance, in the notion of the Southern Baptists, that this is a position that is reasonable to take, not just in light of the Overton window, but in light of their own practical concern for their communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's got, I think, some pretty sobering answers. So, for example, one of the things that you're finding in the white evangelical community, and that's my background. I'm a member of a PCA Church, Presbyterian Church of America, in Franklin, Tennessee, where I live. In the white evangelical community, what you're beginning to see is that white evangelical political thought is almost an exact overlap with the GOP platform. There's some interesting data that was put out by Ryan Burge, who's perhaps one of the best analysts of religious data in the United States. And he was showing how each distinct religious subgroup compares how it sees itself as compared to the different in the different parts and political tribes. So, for example, non-white evangelicals see themselves kind of in between the GOP and the Democratic Party. Black Christians see themselves closer to Democrats, but not all the way identical to the Democratic Party. Atheists see themselves to the left of the Democratic Party, but white evangelicals see themselves right in line with the GOP. And so that has a lot of implications, political implications that aren't necessarily related to Christian theology strictly. And so that's not to say there aren't valid theological arguments about critical race theory. There certainly are. But to what's beginning to happen is that as a matter of course, the white evangelical church is seeing itself as identically affiliated with the GOP, the Republican Party.
So what's that mean for equity and diversity within our institutions from your perspective?
You know what it means, I think, is it is sadly increasingly difficult to separate a argument about equity and inclusion from partisan politics. Okay. So what you will often have is, if somebody is of a conservative political mindset, is that the way in which the Overton window is working on the right is that sometimes, and this may sound, this is very sad, but it is a reality, that if you begin to express concern, for example, for the fact that there were 345 years of systemic racial discrimination by law, protected and enforced through violence, that system, beginning from 1619, running through emancipation and running through Jim Crow, that system has persistent consequences today. You're going to immediately begin to have fend off challenges from the right that are saying that you're woke for making that kind of assertion. And that's harmful to our ability to communicate and to discuss issues of equity and both the legacies of historic discrimination, the existence of present discrimination. I'm talking mainly about the right because that's the community that I come from. That's where I've grown up. That's where I live. And I also know that we have a rise often of illiberalism that we have seen on campuses, where there's less of a willingness to embrace free speech as a value. But, when we're beginning to have extraordinarily complicated issues, like just to stay with the race point for a minute, the way in which racism interacts with the country and our economy, and the history of racism and present racism interacts with a country like ours, with an economy like ours, a complex culture like ours, is extraordinarily complicated, which in my view requires more speech and more debate and more dialogue is to begin to figure out how to deal with it, not less speech and less debate and less dialogue.
That's interesting because it leads me to my next question about rediscovering tolerance, which is a term you coined. The whole idea, well, could you explain to us what rediscovering tolerance is about and what we have been doing to misunderstand tolerance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was inspired in this section of the book by a pseudonymous writer. He writes under the name Scott Alexander. He's a psychologist and lives in Blue America, Blue State, and surrounded in a progressive culture. That he lives in a much more progressive part of the country. And he was beginning to notice a deficiency in tolerance, and with people who would describe themselves as quite tolerant. And so he sort of walked through a kind of a mental exercise, and he asked some people, how would you consider yourself tolerant? And they would say, well, of course, I love people regardless of race and religion and ethnicity and LGBT status and, age, you name it. And he then asks a question, well, what's wrong with those people? And they say, what do you mean? What's wrong with those people? There's nothing wrong with those folks. And he says, well, then what are you tolerating? And there's this element of tolerance that presumes there is something to tolerate, that if there's nothing to tolerate, that's affection, that's warmth. But if there is something that we have to overcome to enter into a relationship, then that is tolerance. And often what I find in our modern United States, in our modern discourse, what we often have to overcome to enter into any kind of respectful relationship is profound disagreement, and disagreement on important issues. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is a recommitment to pluralism. Means understanding that I'm going to live in a community with people with whom I disagree profoundly, and yet I have to learn to tolerate their presence, to accommodate their presence, as opposed to attempting to dominate them out of relevance out of the relevance of our public life.
That's very interesting. How does that pertain to our First Amendment rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the elements of a healthy pluralism is both there's a legal element and a moral element to it. So a healthy pluralism, I believe, can't thrive without free speech. As Frederick Douglass called free speech, that fireside right is the great moral renovator of society and government. And that so free speech is essential to a thriving constitutional republic. But that's an abstract concept. And it's an abstract concept. And what ends up often happening is we only get concerned with free speech when I feel like my speech is in danger, when I feel like somebody is trying to censor me. That's when I get upset. So we're always concerned with the free speech for me. We're not nearly as concerned with free speech for thee. You can take care of yourself. But one of the things that I urge is that, and this is also an aspect of a healthy tolerance, is that we should defend the rights of others that we would like to exercise ourselves. So if you see somebody whose their rights are being violated, and I'm not talking, this is not just aimed at lawyers. I'm a recovering lawyer. I defended people's free speech rights across the political spectrum, but I'm even talking about things as simple as social media engagement. I'll give you a good example. When Colin Kaepernick began to kneel in protest of police brutality and other injustices in the United States, a lot of people, especially on the right, got very, very angry with him for that. They were very, very angry. But also a lot of these people on the right were very tired of cancel culture, right? They disliked the idea that people could be fired for engaging in expression that their boss didn't like or that people on the internet didn't like. So a lot of these people who were engaged in, who hate cancel culture, were also really, really angry with Colin Kaepernick for kneeling. Well, then the president of the United States gets up and he says, fire them, talking about all of the kneeling football players, which there were not that many at that time. Fire them. Well, you would think that people who are opposed to cancel culture would say, no. I might disagree with Colin Kaepernick kneeling. I'm not going to kneel, but fire. No, that's in that cancel culture. Isn't that? And yet, but no, there was cheers. There were cheers across the United States of America at the idea of firing somebody for quietly and peacefully kneeling. And so trying to put these values into practice, I said, whoa, hold on. Hold on. I'm not kneeling for the national anthem, but the idea that Colin Kaepernick should be banished from football or that other players should be fired and otherwise punished for kneeling is repugnant to the culture of free expression. And it's especially repugnant considering that some of the most important cases in constitutional history, including arguably one of the most important free expression cases in constitutional history, was dealing specifically with a command in World War II to salute the flag. This is called West Virginia v. Barnett. And the Supreme Court in the middle of World War II in 1943, when the outcome was still in doubt, held that there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation. It's that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what is orthodox in law, politics, religion, nationalism. And so this direct command to these kneeling football players that they better stand or we're going to call for your firing really violated the spirit of that ruling. And that's a perfect example where people had an opportunity to defend the rights of others that they would like to exercise themselves, to stand up against a version of cancel culture, even if they disagreed with the speech.
So how do you see that impacting equity on our campuses throughout the West and the Pacific? How does that
I think that rule, I think that sort of moral rule of thumb that says I will fight for the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself, has profound implications for equity. Because for this reason, if you look at what is the sort of the fundamental American social compact, what is sort of the most basic element of the American promise? Well, there's this aspirational language in the Declaration of Independence that all, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. All men are created equal. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this all men are created equal. Here are the core rights that were endowed by our creator. This is sort of like the if a corporation is forming and it has like this aspirational mission statement, like Google's used to be what, don't be evil. I can't remember, but something along those lines. So this was like the American mission statement. And then the Bill of Rights first, and then the Civil War amendments building on the Bill of Rights that's a way of we're codifying the mission statement. What does it mean to protect these liberties? Well, it means free speech. It means free exercise of religion. It means due process. It means freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. It means, all these fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights. And then with the Civil War amendments, trying to close this glaring loophole that existed until the Civil War, saying equal protection under the law, that we all enjoy the privileges or immunities of citizenship. And one of the things that I think that this principle of defending the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself does is it preserves that social compact for all of us. We're going to have some disagreements about things like healthcare policy. We're going to have disagreements about foreign policy, about climate policy. We're going to have disagreements on a lot of things. But what we should be able to basically agree on is we all have the same rights to free speech. We all have the same rights to due process. We all have the same rights to be protected against unreasonable search and seizure. We all enjoy the privileges or immunities of citizenship. And this is sort of a fundamental baseline of equity across disagreement that I think is fundamental to the American social compact.
You talk about the American social compact and discuss federalism and the Federalist authors in this social compact. Could you help me understand what that compact was when it was written and how it impacts today's execution of the compact?
Yeah, so we've had kind of bad federalism for a while in this country. So, the founders were, in many ways, we all know the ways in which the founders had various failings, and we've seen that many of the founders were slave owners, and even the documents that they created had problems. No one should look at like the Constitution of the United States of America as like a divinely inspired document. It had problems. It had weaknesses, and among the weaknesses, I'm not going to list all of them, but among the weaknesses was this concept that the Bill of Rights, this fundamental statement of basic American only protected citizen governments had wide latitude to restrict these rights. And so what it ended up happening is that we had for a time, a federalism of the Bill of Rights, where your right to speak was different depending on what state you're in. Your right to speak could vary based on your race, for example. Your right to, we went through centuries of the Bill of Rights not applying to everyone. We went through centuries. We went through centuries where states could widely vary the basic application of this social compact. And so what I say in the book is a healthy federalism says all of that in the social compact has to apply to everyone across the country. There should not be greater free speech rights in one state and less in another. There shouldn't be less due process rights in one state. But outside of that basic social compact, we should return as much power to localities so that people can live in communities that personify their political values. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that we have a really dysfunctional federal government that, in large part because of gerrymandering, because of the checks and balances built into the system, an awful lot of us can live our whole lives and never cast a meaningful vote for a federal office. I mean, I've lived in either a bright red or a bright blue state my whole adult life. I have never cast a meaningful vote for president of the United States. And so by returning power as close as possible to the people, you're going to have a greater latitude to cast votes that are meaningful for shaping your community, so long as we don't make the mistake of our forefathers and be selective in our application of the protections of the Bill of Rights.
You speak at great length about solutions, and you've started to identify some most recently. Can you help me understand other solutions to this division that you see confounding our country?
Yeah. Well, one that I haven't talked about is, look, you can talk all day about legal doctrines. You can talk all day about structural issues like federalism, but nothing will change unless there is at least some level of attitudinal change, some level of aspirational change as far as what we want to be. So one of the things that I talk about is we have to forsake a desire to dominate, replace it with a more pluralistic vision that I think was very well articulated. And look, again, when I talk about the founding fathers, I talk about them fully aware of the flaws, profound flaws that many of these men had. But Lin-Manuel Miranda repopularized one of George Washington's favorite references. And this was actually a verse from scripture that he referenced almost 50 times in his writing. Most famously in a letter to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island, where you had, one of the most persecuted religious minorities in the world, wondering what is our place in this new land. And Washington said this, and it's from the book of Micah. And if you are a fan of the musical Hamilton, you'll remember these words. Every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And that was Washington's way of connecting with this Hebrew congregation to say, you can have a home in this land. And it's a powerful aspirational principle that I think that we have to be able to embrace as Americans, to say to each distinct part of this really an increasingly diverse American family, because we're not going to be getting less diverse. We're just going to be getting more diverse. That yes, every man and woman can sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And that's an aspiration that says you can have a home here. And that's one of the core promises actually of pluralism, is to say in this incredibly diverse community, you can have a home in this place.
Do you see areas where we've made some progress? I grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where in the South, where there was extraordinary constrictions on my freedom to move. At the same time, we've been able to move. Yet I see today where we're reverting back to some of the same patterns that occurred in the 50s, 60s. Can you speak to any idea where we've made progress?
Yeah, well, we have made, as a matter of law, from voting rights to free speech to due process, we have made empirically, there are any number of ways in which we have made progress in the sense of eliminating a lot of the formal, legal, existent barriers to equity, from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to the Voting Rights Act to Brown v. Board of Education. These doctrinal changes are deeply meaningful and have resulted in cultural and economic change in this country, but they have not completed their work by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think one of the things that we do in each generation is it's the responsibility of each generation not to say, yay, look at the progress that we made. Instead, you can acknowledge it and be thankful for the sacrifices that have created that progress. But then the baton passes. And we have to think hard and we have to think creatively about what do we do in our turn? And, one of those things that I've long advocated, and I say, look, if you just say, I want to take the baton, that is not saying I have the solution for this incredibly difficult challenge of equity, of tolerance, of creating a healthy diversity in the United States of America. That I don't have all the solutions, but you can say, I've got this one idea or this other idea or this other idea, and I can make that step and I can make that step and I can make that step. I fear sometimes that we have a problem in our society in which we say, we look at somebody who might be our 80% friend or our 70% friend. In other words, that they agree with us 80% of the time or 70% of the time. But because they're not a 100% friend, we make them a 100% enemy. Because you're not all the way with me, you're not with me at all. And And I think that we have a problem with that in our culture, that we are looking often for reasons to disagree with a person and write them out of relevance when we can be looking for reasons to agree. And I think we've actually seen some concrete ways where that happens. One of the interesting aspects of modern movement towards prison reform and taking baby steps towards ending this catastrophe of mass incarceration in the United States is one of the states that's among the leaders is counterintuitive to a lot of people. It's the state of Texas. And the state of Texas has taken a lot of concrete steps towards prison reform that people who are immersed in that issue will applaud. And part of that is because people said, hey, we're not going to be 100% friends, but where we are friends, by golly, we'll work together. And I think that if we begin to have that kind of, I'll give you a great example of where you're seeing some right-left agreement on a super important issue, qualified immunity. For those participants who don't know what qualified immunity is a legal doctrine created by judges. It's not in the relevant statute that says that the relevant statute passed shortly after the Civil War says that if an agent of the state violates my civil rights, he shall be liable. That's the words in the statute, shall be liable. In other words, I should receive compensation if an agent of this government violates my civil rights. I should be compensated for that. It's basic justice. Well, there's a judge-made doctrine that basically means, shall be liable really means usually shall not be liable. And that you can only get compensation when you pass some very high hurdles. That's qualified immunity. And so there's a bipartisan coalition right now from conservative Christian legal organizations to the ACLU, to libertarians, to civil rights organizations who are all banded together to say qualified immunity is wrong. They don't agree on a lot of other stuff. But this idea, for example, that a police officer can violate a citizen's civil rights and there be no compensation due to that citizen is repugnant to the Constitution. So, hey, yeah, let's agree on that and then see where that leads us.
You also explore in great depth the concept of pluralism
Mm-hmm.
in the book, Divided We Fall. How does that concept impact the notion of equity in a college?
Yeah, colleges in a lot of ways. I mean, it's really interesting, especially in this sort of the atmosphere in the world of the big sort, where we live around like-minded people. Colleges are one of the few places, especially public colleges, where you're actually going to kind of step out of your bubble in a lot of ways, that you're going to be around students from all over the country, from all over your state, sometimes from all over the world. And, in many ways, colleges are excellent laboratories of pluralism. And by pluralism, what I talk about, and I root a lot of the arguments for American pluralism in my favorite Federalist paper, which should be y'all's favorite Federalist paper as well, Federalist number 10. And this is when James Madison was dealing with the challenge that the founders were really worried about, what they called the violence of faction. That how do you deal with competing, strongly held views when in the history of the time and throughout world history, that usually those competing, strongly held views usually end up violently clashing. So how do you deal with the violence of faction? And essentially what Madison said is let many factions bloom. Let many viewpoints bloom. Let many communities bloom. And his sort of view is that when many communities bloom, no one community becomes so dominant or becomes so aggressive that it can snuff out all the remainder, but let many factions bloom. And so it sort of expand the parameters of the republic. And so I think colleges, and you often see this, administrators are used to dealing with the complete alphabet soup of student organizations. There's student organizations at a lot of schools for almost every purpose under the sun. One of my favorites was from many years ago at Ohio State University. I'm sorry, any Ohio residents, the Ohio State University. I got to get it right. The Ohio State University that they had a rule that you would get an automatic allocation of student fee money based on the size of your group. And so somebody formed a group called Students for Free Pizza, which meant that when they joined and they created the group, just because they had students, they got student fee money, which their by bylaws would be spent only on pizza for the group. So you have everything from Students for Free Pizza to every sort of religious and ethnic and causal oriented, political oriented group. And to a remarkable degree, contrary to sort of a lot of the fear mongering you see around the nation, to a remarkable degree at most campuses, this pluralism actually works. It doesn't work without friction. Pluralism, we have to be clear, is not utopianism. It is not. I forget who said this, but he's talking about sort of small L liberalism and pluralism is one of the best Civil War avoidance mechanisms ever created by the mind of man. So you're gonna have friction. It's not ever going to be utopian. It's not going to be everybody's going to get along great. But what you do have is in a functioning pluralistic community like a college is and like a college can be, then what you do have are many different communities all finding a home in that campus.
In colleges around the country, we talk about participatory governance. That is, many parts of the college community having a say in the decision-making process. It is a form of pluralism, as I understand it, but not equal input. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that boy, you're going to get me into the separation of powers on campus. Boy, that's a non-controversial topic. Look, I mean, I think there are a lot of competing interests on campus, and I think that a campus that doesn't provide adequate representation of competing interests is always going to have an unacceptable amount of tension. So, you have concerns about faculty governance and academic freedom and how autonomous are departments, for example, in deciding the mission and direction of the department, the academic sort of direction of the department and the academic standards for the department. All of these things, I think that the way I just in the academic freedom arena, which is sort of my historical area of practice, there's really kind of three layers of academic freedom. There's institutional academic freedom. That is, the institution as the institution can decide, for example, we want to focus on STEM. We want to focus on humanities. We want to focus on different, kinds of scholarly inquiry within the humanities. So these are all things that the institution can decide as an institution. But then that doesn't swallow faculty academic freedom, where within the umbrella of that, the overarching academic decision of the institution, there's a lot of variation and freedom that should exist for faculty to explore different areas of study and to teach even controversial subjects, free from worries about censorship or reprisal. And then students also have their own degree, not just of constitutional rights, but sort of academic freedom rights that are related to that are in the hierarchy, aren't quite in the same place, but also have their position. So these things are complicated. It's a complicated balance, but I think if you don't recognize that each has their place, it's a recipe for an unacceptable amount of tension.
David, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
This has been great and a lot of great takeaways for us. Great activity in the chat room, and it's generating a lot of questions in our Q&A as well. So I would love to ask some of those questions on behalf of those who submitted to both Commissioner Daphne and then also to David French, one of which actually pertains to academic freedom, but we'll ask that one second. The first question is, white supremacists and neo-Nazi groups have adopted the rhetoric of free speech to intentionally straddle the line that prevents institutional action against their hateful speech. Hate speech is not always clearly threatening, but when you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, the coded language is clear. What is the line between free speech and coded hate speech? And how can institutions address these intentional moves to use free speech to perpetuate white supremacism and neo-Nazism on our campuses?
Yeah, so that's a really good question for which there's actually, some pretty comprehensive legal answers to that. So let's break it out, and I'll do it as briefly as possible. Private institutions, public institutions. Okay, so private institutions have an enormous amount of freedom to shape their mission and message and to enforce their mission and institutional mission and message through rules of conduct, and including rules of speech, as long as those rules are clear and they're applied clearly and they're applied according to the written language of the various rules and regulations. An enormous amount of freedom. Mostly you see this exercised by religious institutions. Religious institutions will create their own codes of conduct, including rules of speech that students sign agreement to. And you have a lot of leeway to deal with speech that you deem hateful, organizations that you deem hateful. That there's a lot of freedom on a private campus. And honestly, my advice to the private campus is pretty simple. Decide the culture you want to inculcate. Decide the values you want to transmit, and decide the atmosphere of free speech that you want to permit, and apply it consistently and fairly. Now, public universities and public colleges have a very different situation. And one of the things that public colleges have to realize is there is no constitutional category called hate speech. It doesn't exist. So there is no such ability of a public entity to prohibit hate speech. You don't have that. There are kinds of speech you can prohibit a harassment, as harassment is defined under law. You can prohibit incitement. You can prohibit. There are very narrow categories of speech that are prohibited, but hate speech is not one of them. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that. So what do you do when there's hate speech that is hateful speech that is constitutionally protected on your campus? Well, there's a couple of things. One is institutions have their own right to speak. Institutions have an institutional right to speak. They can condemn speech that they disagree with. They can use the power of educational tools to combat misinformation. They can use educational tools to combat disinformation and bigotry. They can do all of those things. And so I think they can also provide support. They can provide support for students who have been wounded by the words that they hear. But what they cannot do, consistent with the Constitution, is say this category of speech is hate speech, and we're going to ban it. We're going to prohibit it. Or this organization, we believe this organization advances hate speech, and so we're going to ban it. We're going to prohibit it. That's not permitted by the Constitution. And so I think that there's an old saying that a lot of people don't like because it feels sort of unsatisfactory when they really, really, really don't like certain speech. The answer to bad speech is better speech. As a constitutional matter, that's almost always going to be the answer you're going to get. Now, again, that doesn't apply to harassment. Harassment is a legally defined term that's not necessarily related to the viewpoint of the speech, but often the time and the place and the manner of the speech. But harassment, a university can prohibit properly defined harassment. It cannot prohibit hate speech. It can't. And so what it has to do is use its educational tools at its disposal to combat it, as opposed to its punitive tools.
It's a great answer. I think we can have a whole session just on that topic alone. So thank you for that. This question comes to us from Dr. Maria Wright. She asks, related to our discussion on free speech, this makes me think of academic freedom as it pertains to academia. What recommendations would you make for higher ed institutions that have to navigate supporting diverse student groups while also maintaining protection of academic freedom?
Boy, that's a really good question. So again, we can slice this into private and public. Private universities and private institutions are going to have a great ability to say our academic freedom is going to trump. And again, this all has to be done clearly, plainly, not on an ad hoc basis or a post hoc basis. But our decision to operate as X kind of educational institution means that students who voluntarily come to this school are going to have to the extent they want to form student groups, to the extent that they want to engage in advocacy, to the extent that they want to use their own speech, to try to participate in this academic community, they're going to fit within that academic mission of the school. That's what a private university has the ability to do. Most private universities, however, say, hey, we want is they essentially copy the rules and doctrines that apply to public universities. They don't truly try to restrict student free speech as much as they theoretically can. But again, when you're a private institution, the academic freedom of the institution is so much greater, and its ability to control the academic freedom of those other members of the community is so much greater than a public university. With a public university, essentially when you're talking about the various student groups, these student groups are mainly not coming to the administration with a posture of quote unquote academic freedom rights, but more from a posture of constitutional rights. And so what they're going to be able to say is, we are entitled by law to what's called viewpoint neutrality in your policy, in the way in which you administer your policies. You can't favor one kind of viewpoint over another in the dispensation of student fee funds. You cannot favor one viewpoint over another in access to university facilities. If you're going to allow diverse student groups to exist at all, you can't say we're going to allow student groups with one viewpoint but not another viewpoint. And so, in essence, what you're looking at with public universities as a viewpoint neutrality requirement in its dealings with its student groups. And a lot of administrators, but this is something that's really sunk in much more in this era than it did, say, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, viewpoint discrimination was rampant across the United States. And 20 years of litigation has meant that now viewpoint discrimination cases are much less common.
Thank you. So here's a question from Tim Adel, who asks, over the years, conservatives have seen themselves as unrepresented in academia and have started to consider us the enemy. How can we reach out to them and expand both windows for communication while still advancing equity?
That's a great question. I think one of the things, especially again for public institutions, is faithful protection of constitutional rights is step one. So what that means is protecting the constitutional rights of all students, conservative, liberal, moderate, whatever, radical, boring, it doesn't matter. The baseline preservation of constitutional rights is step one. And that applies to students and student engagement. Now, it also applies to hiring. So, for example, a university, a college is prohibited from retaliating against someone on the basis of even in employment on the basis of a constitutionally protected expression. So you have to be very careful that, for example, you don't say, well, this person is, and also there are civil rights laws that are applicable as well. This person has engaged in religious speech I don't like, therefore they shouldn't really be seriously considered for a position in the sociology department. That's unlawful. It's unlawful. It's workplace discrimination. It's unconstitutional. So basically a very basic step one, just be vigorous in complying with the law. Step two, I would say, one of the things that's happened is that we've now created we have a system where I think a lot of people who are conservatives, intellectual conservatives, often don't even consider a career in academia because they just don't think it'd be open for them. They just don't think it'd be open. But I do think that the colleges, institutions that see talented people that are maybe ideologically out of the mainstream of the campus, whichever direction that goes, because every campus has a kind of a rough parameters of an ideological mainstream, sort of aggressively going out and recruiting people that you think would be an asset to this community is, I think, an important aspect of enhancing diversity on a number of fronts, from race, ethnicity, religion, ideology. I think that there is a real value in an aggressive attempt to seek diversity across a full spectrum. But at this point, it's just hard. Look, I've talked to an awful lot of academic institutions and a lot of academic departments, and they'll say to me, hey, look, I mean, I've been doing hiring in sociology for 25 years, and I've literally never seen what I would say is a CV from a conservative applicant. So how can I have a more conservative department? And, the answer to that is, well, I don't have a good answer for that. Because there has been sort of this process of separation and suspicion on the part of an awful lot of conservatives where they just don't even try. And so one of the things that I do when I speak to mainly, I'm an attorney by training, by education, I speak to a lot of law student groups, and I say, don't assume the academy is going to be hostile to you. Don't assume it. If you've got the credentials for it, if you've got the CV for it, and you want to try it, try it. Because what we have is this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy now, I think, in part of the American right, which is they're not going to be hot, they're not going to be welcoming to me, so I'm just not even going to try. And then guess what? There's not conservatives there. And so I think that there's an obligation, I think, on the part of people who have the credentials to and want to do it, to try.